By now, I've spent $27,000 on storytelling courses, and I learned 25 lessons that made really the entire investment worth it. Today, I'm going to share all of them. Lesson number 1. Imagine you're watching this nature documentary, and the scene starts with this camera shot all the way from the helicopter. Like, you see the forest below, you see the ocean stretching. It's beautiful. But after a while, you're like, dude, give me some action. I want to see the lion approaching his prey. Your stories, they're no different. Yes, you can start with that overview, with that helicopter shot, but then you want to zoom in. Lesson number 1, zoom into the moment. Don't just say, I faced a difficult challenge. No, that's boring. The better way is to zoom into the moment. So you describe the manager pacing around the room, maybe the intern spilling coffee, or maybe that handshake that turns everything around. Give your audience something to see, hear, and feel. Lesson number 2. Next is a technique that requires, I would say, minimal change, but has just a huge payoff. Instead of saying, I wanted to run a marathon. Well, that's pretty boring, right? Say, the marathon was in 7 days. And I'd never run more than 10 kilometers in my life. Lesson number 2, add a ticking clock. Now, time pressure makes everything feel much more intense. When you tell your audience that there's way too little time to complete this massive task, they'll feel the tension and they'll be much more engaged. Lesson number 3, don't start your story like this. Let me tell you a story, okay? Don't do that. No, don't say the S word. The S word is story. Some people hear the word story and it triggers this negative expectation. They think like, here we go again. Do we have time for this 15-minute fairy tale? Instead of saying the word story, say experience, event, example, or case. Let me give you an example. 2 weeks ago, I had a very interesting experience. And then you launch into your story. Lesson number 4. The best stories are emotional. And the easiest way to make your story more emotional is to share what you were thinking in that moment. Now, you have thousands and thousands of thoughts every single day. Hopes, dreams, fears, crazy thoughts. Now share some of those thoughts in that crucial moment of the story. Lesson number 4, think out loud. So instead of saying, I was worried about the presentation, share the thoughts. Maybe those were like, I thought, how am I going to turn this around? My manager already thinks that I'm useless. When you share those thoughts, give us the raw, unfiltered thoughts, not this super polished or super professional version. When you share what was going on through your mind, your story will instantly feel much deeper, much more relatable. Lesson number 5. Imagine you walked across this room in front of a bunch of people with an empty glass. Nothing special, right? But now, imagine you do that same walk, but this time with a full glass in your hand. And then also, someone tells you, if you spill just one drop, your entire family will die. Now you're like, you walk across this room, every single person in the room just watches every single step you take, holding their breath. That is lesson number 5. Raise the stakes. Tell your audience what's on the line. What happens if you win? What happens if you lose? What will be the impact on your life, but also on the life of your loved ones? Raise the stakes. Lesson number 6. Way too many storytellers share those unnecessary details. They're like, I was 16 years old, I had braces, I had messy hair, and I was wearing this band shirt. Like, cool. Who cares? That's not memorable. The better way is to reveal some personality quirk, something that is a little bit unique about you as a character. Lesson number 6, show personality quirks. You can say, for example, I was the type of person who made a pros and cons list even before choosing breakfast. Quirks like that, they bring your character to life and they help your audience see you in this more unique, more memorable way. Lesson number 7. Stories aren't just about impressing people, but they're about connecting with your audience. The easiest way to build trust is to share something that you struggled with. Vulnerability builds trust. So instead of pretending to have it all together, share maybe the messy, the not so good part, the imperfections. Vulnerability shows that you're human, and that's at the end what makes people trust you. Lesson number 8. I've seen it so many times. A shit story, average at best, but then suddenly turning into this incredible story just because of one thing, a big surprise. Something totally unexpected, a twist that no one saw coming. Lesson number 8, surprise your audience. Now that surprise can be anything unexpected. An unexpected event, a weird reaction, or maybe even an unusual decision. Anything that your listeners didn't see coming. Lesson number 9. This is the technique that I use the most in my stories. Now, imagine if I shared a story like that. Well, in that moment, my boss informed me that he wasn't impressed with my presentation and that I should prepare more. That's super boring, right? Now, the better way is to share the exact words of that moment to bring the story to life. Lesson number 9, share the dialogue. Back to that same example. In that moment, my boss walked up to me and said, "Philipp, what the hell was that? You were all over the place. Did you even look at the slides before?" Now we're talking. Now it's much juicier, right? Lesson number 10. This is something that took a while for me to learn, but something that has had a massive impact on my storytelling skills. Before, I always used to think that I would have to tell this full story anytime, like with a start, with a middle, and an end. Now, when you're starting off, that full story can feel incredibly awkward, like so overwhelming. But now, years later, I realized that you actually don't need to tell the full story. You can just tell snippets of that. Lesson number 10, tell micro stories. So instead of sharing the full story, share maybe a single pivotal moment from that story. Maybe it's this moment of realization. Maybe it's this one conversation that stood out, or maybe this one meaningful thing that touched your heart. Example, right then he looked me in the eye and said, "You have no idea what this means to me." Those micro stories will feel much more authentic, and they'll help you get much more comfortable using stories in your day-to-day. Lesson number 11. Stories often don't land because the stories feel too polished, too rehearsed, not as if the storyteller was really connecting to the story. Now, to fix that, visualize the scene unfolding in front of your eyes as you speak. Lesson number 11, relive the moment. When you tell that story, imagine you're back in that moment and then just describe it as if it was unfolding in front of your eyes. So where are you? What are you seeing? What are you thinking? What are you hearing? When you describe what you see and feel in real time, the story will feel more emotional, more vivid, and much more engaging. Lesson number 12. This is actually something that I still struggle with today. Often when I tell a story, I move into this performance mode. I'm like, it was October 2022. I was in my apartment in Amsterdam. Sometimes when I share a story, my voice changes and suddenly I sound more like this motivational speaker or this fairy tale uncle. Lesson number 12, drop the storytelling voice. Now tell your story in the same way you'd share it with a close friend, a family member, or even your therapist. Tell your story as conversational as possible. Lesson number 13. You've probably heard by now thousands and thousands of stories, but probably you forgot 99% of them. Now, why is that? Because they were missing one crucial element. They sound like, I was that type of person before, I did this crazy stuff, and I was the same person after. Now, they don't have any element of change. Lesson number 13, show the change. Show us who you were before, what you did, but how it changed you. What was the transformation? If, for example, you were completely out of shape, now you're running a marathon. If you were terrified of public speaking, now you love being on stage. Show the transformation. Lesson number 14. Have you ever watched a movie where everything just went perfectly? Of course not. It would be a movie. Yet this is somehow how we often tell our stories. We're like, well, we launched the product and everything went perfectly. Lesson number 14, conflict is king. Bring in some sort of conflict, a difficult decision, an emotional challenge, a physical challenge, any type of conflict. Even if your conflict is maybe opening that stubborn bottle of ketchup, bring in some sort of conflict. Without conflict, it's not a story. Lesson number 15. Every great story has this one single moment where everything shifts. It's maybe this decision, realization, or any sort of breakthrough. A 5-second moment that changes everything. Lesson number 15. Find the turning point. For example, this can be maybe the second that you decided to leave your toxic job, or maybe that moment when your partner said, "Let's do this." Every great story should have this 5-second moment that changes everything. That's the heartbeat of your story. That's where everything else builds up to just to that final moment. Lesson number 16. People are usually pretty rigid when it comes to their stories. They're like, "I timed it and it takes exactly 2 minutes, 35 seconds. I need that time to tell the full story." But hey, this is not how life works. Sometimes you have 30 seconds, sometimes you get 5 minutes to tell your story. The best storytellers know how to adjust their stories. Lesson number 16, scale your stories. Practice telling a 3-minute version, a 90-second version, a 30-second version. This helps you know what are the essentials, what can you eliminate, but most importantly, it helps you to adapt the story to any setting or audience. Lesson number 17. One of the biggest mistakes people do when telling stories is to give too much context. They're like, "It was a sunny Tuesday afternoon. The birds were chirping and the air smelled a little bit like lavender." Dude, seriously, like no one cares. Unless those details are crucial later, skip them. Lesson number 17, jump into action. The better way is to make your character do something. Biking, shouting, talking, any sort of action. Example, it's October 2024. I'm standing in front of that conference room, taking a deep breath. When you share the action, your audience can imagine the scene unfolding in front of their eyes. Lesson number 18. When I started on my storytelling journey, I thought that great stories, they have to be about these huge events like the near-death experience or this spiritual awakening. But here's the problem. Those stories, sure, they can be entertaining, but they're not relatable. Lesson number 18, focus on small, relatable moments. So instead of sharing about those gigantic life stories, share those tiny stories. Maybe a story about you missing the bus, learning something small, or just having this moment of realization. Those are the moments that build that connection. Lesson number 19. The best storytellers, they aren't necessarily the ones with the best stories, but the best storytellers are the ones with the most stories. Now, think about it. If you have, let's say, only 3 stories, well, there won't be that many options where you can tell them. Imagine you had 30, 50, or even 100 stories. Well, then you will always have exactly the right story for the right moment. So lesson number 19, start a story bank. A story bank is this central place where you save and organize your stories. So what I usually save in there is the title, the lesson, the summary, and maybe the theme. I'll actually include my template in the description below so that you don't have to start from scratch. But by saving your stories, you'll never run out of stories again in your life. Lesson number 20. There's one exercise that has helped me more than any other exercise to become a better storyteller, but also a better speaker. Now that is to improvise stories. Now, what I do still almost on a daily basis, I go online, go on this random topic generator, get a random topic, and then start improvising that story. I speak for like 1 to 2 minutes. I try to use the structure that I know, and I try to make it as interesting, as visual as possible. But when you're starting off, don't overthink it. Just start improvising. Improvisation is this powerful tool that will help your mind to think much more quickly on the spot, but also helps you become a much more confident storyteller. Lesson number 21. If you say, for example, "I was nervous," well, your audience, they hear those words, but they cannot see that emotion. They cannot feel the emotion behind those words. But if you say instead, That moment, my hands were shaking, my throat just felt so dry, and my heart was just pounding like a drum. Well, when you share that, then your audience can really see and feel the emotion. So lesson number 21, show, don't tell. Describe what the emotion looks like. How does your body, how does your face change when going through that emotion? The more your audience can see that, the more they will connect to your story. Lesson number 22. By now, you probably have hundreds and hundreds of untold stories. Stories that you just haven't noticed yet. Now, the easiest way to find them is to look for the highs and the lows from a specific period in your life. So pick a time, like let's say the first year in your job, or maybe the last year in your relationship. And then ask yourself, what were the highs and the lows during that period? Now, what were the moments that, let's say, I was particularly happy, where I was particularly excited, or maybe sad or disappointed? Once you have that, ask yourself, what did I learn during that moment? And then, if you like that lesson, well, craft a short story around that lesson. It's such an easy way to have this pool of stories. Lesson number 23. Now, trying to memorize your story word for word can often make you feel a little bit stiff, like a little bit fake. The better way is to think of your story as a map, right? You know where you're starting off, you know roughly where to stop along the way, and you also know the final destination. But the route, how you get there, well, that one you're a little bit more flexible. You can adapt as needed. Lesson number 23. Memorize the start, the scenes, and the finish. So, memorize your first few lines. Then you memorize the key scenes or moments where the story takes place. And then lastly, memorize the last lines of your story. That will keep your delivery pretty natural and actually helps you recover when you get lost at one point in your story. Lesson number 24. You've probably told a few stories before, but maybe you actually have no clue how you're actually landing, how you're actually coming across while telling the story. When I started, for example, telling my stories, I often looked like this grumpy teenager who really hated life. But back then I didn't know. I only realized that once I actually saw a video of me speaking. Lesson number 24, record yourself. Yes, I know, recording yourself can be awkward at first, but it helps you understand how you come across. Once you've watched yourself, you'll know what things you can improve on. Lesson number 25. After watching yourself speak, it's tempting to fix everything, right? Your gestures, your pauses, your filler words, everything. When we try to focus on too many things, you won't make any progress at all. So lesson number 25, fix one thing at a time. Now focus on one area that you want to improve on. Now, which area should you pick? Work on the one thing that distracts people the most from your story. For example, if you use a few filler words throughout your story, probably doesn't matter. But if you use a filler word every single 5 seconds, well, it will probably become distracting. So what I would say is focus on the thing that distracts the most. That's it. Those are 25 lessons I learned from all those courses. But hey, I'm mindful that we moved quite fast today. But hey, I also recorded another video that actually goes much more into the details of each one of those lessons. So go ahead and check it out now.